Thank you so much for that introduction, Varsha. It's always really humbling. And thank you all for coming, and welcome to the Community Engaged. Jamie, you just got here in perfect time. Please come down and join us, no problem. We have others who are kind of stuck in traffic. It's really yucky out there, and I think all of us are ready for winter to be over. Hopefully there will be an end in sight. But anyways, welcome to what I think is really the place to be right now, because what we're going to be talking about today and this weekend is how we can use scholarship to really confront the foremost challenges of our world. And I think that that's something that's really exciting. We're here to honor the work that students and faculty have done to create a space for people to know about what's being done and how we can actually use research and academic work to make positive impacts and changes in the world. And that's all about why I decided to be a historian and do the work that I do, to kind of study the past and understand the mistakes in the past so that we can learn from them to change and improve the present. So it's something that I'm very deeply committed to, and I am truly honored to be a part of this conference and to serve as chair of this conference. So we're gonna kick off what I think is a really exciting lineup with a panel of faculty who are scholar activists who embody the values of the conference and putting their research to work in furthering human rights, improving public health, and raising awareness of how race, class, gender, and culture are intertwined. And today, these renowned scholars will discuss the way that their own research interests intersect with social justice, as well as to explore how different disciplines interrogate questions of equity. So let me introduce them. First, we have Dr. Gabriela Soto-Laveaga, who is a professor of history of science at Harvard University. She obtained her PhD from UC San Diego and has held postdoctoral and visiting scholar positions at the medical school at UC San Francisco in the Department of Anthropology, History, and Medicine, at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the Department of History of Medicine and Bioethics, and at the very prestigious Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin. She has held numerous grants, including those from Ford, Mellon, Fulbright, Dad, and Gerda Henkel Foundations. We also have Dr. Heather Shattuck-Heidorn, who is a biological anthropologist who studies how our environments, social and physical, become embodied. She received her PhD in human evolutionary biology at Harvard University with a secondary field in studies of women, gender, and sexuality. She has conducted both international and domestic research projects focused on understanding human health and biology, and currently works as the Maine State Refugee Health Coordinator. And last but not least, we have Dr. Jamie Hillman, who is a multifaceted musician who is an active singer, pianist, conductor, music educator, and composer. As a Boston University prison arts scholar, issue near and dear to my heart, and faculty member of BU's Metropolitan College Prison Education Program, he has co-initiated a comprehensive choral music program at a large, medium-high security men's prison in Massachusetts. In addition, he serves as Associate Music Director at Grace Chapel in Lexington, Massachusetts. He is the 2012 laureate of the Leslie Bell Prize for Choral Conducting from the Ontario Arts Council. As a choral conductor and pianist, he has performed with groups across North America, Europe, and Asia. Dr. Hillman received his doctorate of musical arts at Boston University. So the way this is going to work, we really want this to be something that's conversational, so it's a roundtable format. There won't be kind of formal presentations. I'm going to engage a bit with the panel, and they'll tell you about their own kind of personal journey and the work that they do, and then we really want to try to open it up for as much just genuine discussion and conversation between those up here and all of you out there as possible. So I'm just gonna open it up and kind of pose the same question to all of you, which is if you could talk a little bit about how your own kind of personal history and experiences brought you to the research that you do. Yeah, sure. Yeah. We'll go in the order of presentation, so Gabriela starts.
Yeah, so first of all, welcome all of you here on this rather not sunny day. But I wanted to begin with a question, and I wanted to see how many of you can name 3 Latin American scientists or their inventions, or inventions that have come from Latin America. How about 1? This is what I do. So the fact that we can't answer that question tells us a lot about the type of histories that get written, but also the type of histories that we know about. So for me, it's really important that when we think of science, or we think of medicine, or we think of scientists, or we think of where scientific knowledge is produced, that we change the narrative to include spaces such as Latin America, and especially Latin Americans as producers of scientific knowledge. So much of my previous work, both my first and my second book, have dealt with this question broadly, but also on a much more narrow term. So if I were to ask you another question, do you know where the birth control was first invented? I'll give you a hint, you can refer to the first question. Yeah, Latin America, thank you so much. We have a quick learner over here. Did not bring prizes, but you would have won one. Specifically in Mexico. So we don't tend to think of Mexico as a place where oral contraceptives were invented. And when I learned about this when I was in my PhD program, and it was my first year, and I had gone to Mexico to do a summer program, and someone gave a talk, much like this one, and they said it is an irony that in this country where the pill was discovered, there is still an overpopulation problem. And I was certain that I had misheard. Because in my mind, this just did not make sense. So I went back to my campus after the summer was over, and I started looking into chemistry books. And there it was, in a footnote. Oral contraceptives had been invented in Mexico. I thought, how did I make it into a PhD program? Being Mexican, and not knowing this. What happened with what I thought had been excellent training? So that series of questions led me to produce what became my dissertation, then my first book. Simply asking the question, how do we remember certain events, or how do we tell certain stories? Who gets written out of the narrative of scientific discovery, and the why? So we all knew the story of Margaret Sanger, for example. That name might be familiar from high school if you were paying attention to reproduction or contraceptive classes. But then when I went back to Mexico and was doing research for this said dissertation, I realized that the story was more complex, because it wasn't just the story of certain countries that were being left out of the narrative, but even within that, certain people. As it turned out, in order to create the first oral contraceptives, you needed raw material. And that raw material was coming from the jungles of Mexico, and it needed to be dug out. It was a wild yam. And guess who was digging the yams? It was local people, mainly indigenous peasants. And it was their local knowledge of the ecology, of the environment, of rainfall, of the size of yams, that allowed scientists in labs to be able to further their research. So I suddenly realized it wasn't just a story of not being able to tell where scientific discovery comes from, but who is involved in that discovery. And when you expand that definition outside of laboratory walls and expand that knowledge, you get a completely different story. So the way that I see my engagement and my work is by researching and telling these stories. And when I teach, constructing a syllabus in such a way that those voices are heard from the beginning. Because it's really difficult if you only read authors that come from the Western canon to then begin to think of a larger subset of thinkers, of philosophers that need an adjective before their name. Ethnomusicologist, or Indian philosophy, or why, or Mexican science. It's science. So if we begin from the get-go with a syllabus that incorporates these multiple voices from multiple places, even if they are translated sources, especially if they are translated sources, then we, as scholars, and I'm including you in this, have a much broader understanding of what constitutes our world.
Perfect, thank you. Heather.
Hi, thank you for inviting me, and thank you all for being here. That was a really great answer, and I think for me it mirrors parts of my own process of coming to become an engaged researcher. So I do scientific research. I'm a practicing scientist. And I also have a long-standing commitment to feminist theories, to multicultural work. For a long time, I thought that those were two relatively independent areas. When I was an undergraduate, I would work in the Multicultural Center and work in the Women's Resource Center, and then I also had my scientific classes, and I didn't see necessarily a lot of overlap between those two areas. I think one of the sort of aha moments for me actually came in between undergraduate and graduate school, and I was working in a lab, and we were working with a lot of samples. I'm a human biologist, and so one of the things I study is variation in human biology and how it relates to our social and physical environments. I work with a lot of people who work in communities around the world, trying to understand how human biology varies between places, say, Boston, rural Ecuador, Poland, or the west coast of Africa. And what I mean by that is how very specific aspects of, say, immune function or the composition of breast milk vary in concert with your early life physical environment, maybe with your social stressors that you're experiencing in the moment. And it's it's lab-based analytical work. We're looking at serum, we're looking at saliva samples, dried blood spots. And so I'm working in this lab, and I'm not a graduate student at the time. I'm applying to programs. And I'm working with all this serum that comes from, at the time it was from the Chamani and the Shuar, which are forager horticulturalist groups in Bolivia and Ecuador, respectively. And it's in 2009. And in 2009-10, there's a really famous case in America where the Havasupai Indians who live in the Grand Canyon area in Arizona sued I think it was UCLA that they sued, but they sue UCLA to return their biological samples that they've given to these scientists. And the scientists have conducted research with the samples that they didn't consent to. And so I'm in this laboratory and I'm working with these vials of serum all day long. And the serum comes from indigenous peoples in Central and South America. And at the same time, on a TV within the lab, we're watching as this court case plays out. And then as a freezer, which looks very much like the freezer in the lab that I'm in, is on TV, and the scientists are returning the actual samples to the Havasupai Indians over this freezer. And they're doing this like a ritual involving bringing back the samples. And it was this moment where I realized scientific research is a practice in which we can ask questions about the world, but it's also a series of social relationships that are very much embedded in the culture and the society that we live in. And that process, so as I start my graduate program, that process continues, and I start to look to gender theory, colonial theory, to try to help me understand the process of scientific research itself, even as I'm gearing up to conduct my own graduate level research. My graduate research, in many ways, was a very classic scientific research project. I worked with people in a public health research site in the Gambia, in Africa. I did lab analyses on serum samples. I conducted domestic research working with immigrants to the U.S. Because they had. There is a sister site in Ecuador where they were from that was also running a research study, so we had comparative samples. And it was a project in which I collected dried blood spots. I measured different aspects of people's life via surveys and questionnaires. And during this time, I was thinking about this practice of scientific research as an institution, and sort of the assumptions that are baked into the practice of science. And there are a series of assumptions baked in to how we practice science. One of them is that the researcher is the person who is objectively somehow qualified to determine what the best set of research questions is. And as you're talking about how we exclude certain people from our narrative of scientific history, we also exclude people systematically from practicing science within society. And so what we end up having is we have a system in which we act as if we're having these neutral, objective hypotheses about the world, but they're actually being created predominantly by one sector of society. And so as I'm sort of thinking this through and drawing on a lot of feminist theory and different bodies of theory to help me understand this, I'm also conducting my scientific research, and then I also am continuing to wear my social justice hats. And when I'm wearing my social justice hats, I'm out in the community working with people and things that have nothing to do with academic science at all. And I'm hearing from people about their experience with academic researchers. So I was working with a African-American organization in Central Mass, and my friend was telling me about how he was just so disappointed about these researchers that had been to visit his community. They'd done this project there, and then they disappeared, and like nobody ever heard of the results. And it's the same story over and over. I was seeing the same story of how communities felt disenfranchised by the process of academic research. They were feeling in different ways, somewhat like the case that I was watching play out on the TV was showing, where they were feeling like their concerns weren't necessarily represented in the research questions, alienated from the research, and then disenfranchised by the whole process of research itself. And I wanted to make a commitment to not do that type of science. So it is hard to break out of that structure of science. Everything about science as an institution, when you apply for postdocs or when you apply for tenure track positions, you're talking about what research you're going to do over the next 3 to 5 years. What programs are you going to run? When you apply for grants, you're applying for grants to fund years of funding, and you're talking about the research that you want to do from your position of expertise. And I don't want to deny that when you spend a lot of time training for something that you have a level of expertise. But there's a lot of questions to ask in the world, and there's no particular reason that one set of questions should be so privileged over other sets of questions. So for me, I'm a relatively new, I'm a junior scholar. I graduated last year with a PhD, and I decided to take a job out of academia for a while. I'm the Maine State Refugee Health Coordinator. My work continues to focus on questions around immigrant health, immune function, chronic disease risk, same sets of questions. But I have positioned myself within a community in a different way. So I also am continuing to teach students here at Harvard and at a local university in Maine, where I live now. So as an example of how this changed my positioning, I work hand in hand with people from the immigrant community on a wide variety of issues that are not related to my research questions, where we work on things from community health worker projects to help get outreach around and education around latent tuberculosis to the immigrant community, bringing in people with expert knowledge and things like clinical counseling to folks from different communities to try to increase provider capacity within Maine. Very specific little issues, lots of things. But then I'm also working on academic research proposals, and these research proposals are the same sorts of topics that I studied before. It's around immune function, stress biology. And we're building the proposals from the ground up, working with people in the immigrant community to help understand there is a universe of fundable projects. You can't divorce science too much from what's fundable. Scientific research costs a lot of money. So these are a universe of fundable projects. Myself and my collaborators are bringing this set of expertise to it. And can we find an area of intersection, which are projects that people are actually interested in seeing happen in the community and that can produce data that's usable by folks in the community? So through that, we're honing in on immigrants who come, refugees and asylum seekers who immigrate in the last few years of adolescence. It's a really hard time to immigrate for those folks because they get put into school matched on their age, not on their educational background or their English ability level, and they're on the cusp of transitioning into adulthood in many cultures. So at this point, I'm designing community-based research. I'm also working with another collaborator to build the capacity of communities to understand academic research and how academic questions might differ from, say, therapeutic intervention questions, and to design their own research. And so we're working to host multi-day learning institutes that are fully funded for participants from the immigrant community that were refugees and asylum seekers in Maine. Have a wide variety of basically small nonprofits run by immigrants that are doing a ton of direct service work within their communities. And so how can we help people within those help support the development of capacity within those organizations to do self-directed research and to understand the benefits that research can bring to a community and have the research support the community rather than have it be sort of extracted from the community. Where that will go in the future, I think, is an open question. I'm interested in transferring back into research academia within a few years and seeing if there's a way to do a truly engaged research that works with the community, with communities the whole way, maybe immigrant, maybe not immigrant communities, and see if we can have that happening within an academic institution. Thank you.
Great. Jamie.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very glad to be here and to be part of the conversation today. As you heard, I am a musician. A lot of my training has been in choral music as a conductor. And I research choral music and participatory music in unlikely places. So during my doctoral study across the river at BU, I began becoming bored with music in schools and choral music in schools, and bored with choral music in churches. Those are the likely places. And so I wanted to find a venue where people really needed the benefits of choral music and participatory music. And musical experiences have changed my life. They've transformed my life, and I wanted to see that transformation in others. So a professor of mine, an advisor of mine at BU, has done work in prisons and bringing music into prisons all around the world. And so he and I were having a conversation one day, and we said, what's happening with faculty-led music programs in Boston area prisons? And so we did some Google searches, and we talked to some colleagues, and we found that little to nothing was being done in terms of faculty-led programs in prisons. And so I joined up with Boston University Prison Education Program to create a program for prisoners at MCI Norfolk, the largest men's prison in Massachusetts, and then also MCI Framingham, a women's prison, and to bring participatory music they're called inmates there. And it's something that has transformed my life as a musician and as a professor. I'm not sure how much you are aware of the incarceration catastrophe here in the United States, but I know we all have our eyes on graphs about gun violence in schools in the United States, and we see, the United States at the top, and then far below are every other country on the planet. And it's the same thing. Like, those graphs look the exact same when you look at mass incarceration in the United States, the over-incarceration of black males. For instance, I can give you some specific stats after and some sources if you'd like. But for instance, the average length of time for a Caucasian person to be in jail for a violent offense is essentially the same amount of time for someone who is African American with a drug offense. And the number of people who are in prisons who have actually not committed crimes, those who haven't even had trials but have just succumbed to plea deals. So we might think about the system as being a just system, but through my research, I've actually found that in many cases, it is not a just system. And so I've seen that in real life. And so what does it look like to bring music into a prison each week, or to teach music in a prison each week? So I go every week to MCI Norfolk every single Wednesday morning. In many ways, it's like going to the airport and taking off your shoes and taking off your belt and taking off your coat and all of that. But getting into a room with prisoners at this medium high security prison and forgetting where we are and just making music. And music is something that I believe is innate to all of us. I believe that every single person in this room can sing. Just like every single person in this room could go to the gym and improve his or her physique. I believe that every single person has an innate vocal instrument. If you can talk, you can sing, and you can make music with one another, and you can express yourself through music. And so I've learned stories from the men and the women that I work with at the prison. I've learned what has led to their incarcerations, but I have not asked those questions. I have used music to bring out some of those stories. So each week I have the men at MCI Norfolk journal. And one of the questions, an example of a question that I asked them is, what is the first song that you remember hearing as a child? And what's the last song that you'd like to hear before you die? And so a question like that, I mean, it seems like it's about music, and in some ways it is, but you find out a lot about a person and how they're raised. And I think about my son, who's 4 years old, who likes to play police, and he wants to be a police officer when he grows up. And he'll play, bad guys, the bad guy was driving too fast and he's going to jail. And I think we, as adults in society, can have that same type of thinking. Someone did a bad thing and they're in jail. But there are stories. There's stories of poverty. There's race issues, as I mentioned. So it's not just black and white. It's not just someone committed a crime and they are in jail, but there's usually a lot more to it. Systemic racism, poverty, as I mentioned. And so I have used quotes from the inmates with whom I have worked, especially quotes from those who have been released from prison, and then I've been able to to meet with some of the students that I've taught who have been released from prison, and been able to record their stories in my research. And it's been really transformational. It's been a transformative experience for me as a musician and as a researcher, and I've been able to pass this on to my students as well, many of whom have joined me in visiting the prisons.
Great. Thank you all for being so open and sharing kind of your own personal journey and the work that you do. I think the passion is really evident. So we are gearing up for a conversation that should be very rich and lively. So one of the things, you've all, as Varsha mentioned, received a copy of my book. And so that was, my attempt combing through these archives to try to identify some of, as I mentioned earlier, like the root causes of mass incarceration, which Jamie just gave you a really great picture of just how serious a problem it is. And so that's kind of the scholarly work that looks at root causes and tries to understand it as a historical process. But for me, a really important part of that work is also, what can I do responsibly as a researcher to help solve it? So one of the things that I've been doing, I was on leave this year doing research for another project, or last year, and then I came back this year, and I've really been working to try to think about how at Harvard we can use our resources to help people who are incarcerated receive higher education. So to expand some of the BU program, which has been in operation for a very long time, and to provide even more resources and learning opportunities for people who are behind bars. So I wanted to kind of bring that question to the panel in terms of thinking about what you think the role of higher education should be in promoting ideas of equity and social justice, because some people think that the university doesn't have a role necessarily in involving themselves in these sorts of programs. So I'd just love to hear if you could talk some about what higher education should be doing to advance the issues that I'm sure everybody in this room cares about very deeply. Anybody can start.
I'll start. That's a fantastic question. And I think we as educators at whatever level, we have a commitment to, of course, to teach, but I think it's to, in a way, also make students a little bit uncomfortable, because you need, and here's what I mean by uncomfortable. We all have a set of ideas and we have opinions. And when you come to the university, many of your ideas will be challenged. And you're here to learn not only how to expand your viewpoint, but also to defend your viewpoint or to accept other viewpoints. And it's when you say, whoa, wow, maybe I was really not thinking about that the way I should have. That it's that moment when you're like, ooh, I don't really know as much as I thought I did about that topic. Maybe I should really learn a bit more before I express my opinion so openly. So I feel that it is our role to push students to think a bit more critically about these issues. And it's precisely those issues that make us uncomfortable in society that should be brought to the fore in the classroom, because it makes us, in a way, better prepared citizens to be able to engage, because we have already had the privilege or the luxury of speaking about poverty in a classroom. The fact that we can discuss the roots of racism, the fact that we can talk about gender inequality and discuss it from a philosophical, historical, socioeconomic point of view in a classroom, that is privilege. Because we are in a space discussing issues that at that moment we are not living or experiencing. And it's in this hypothetical. And bringing that hypothetical immediately brings it to your table. I have this, I have my students do oral histories of an immigrant. But when they write the report, I have them do it in the first person. Even though they interviewed the person, instead of writing it in the third person, it's, for example, I crossed the Sonoran Desert to come into this country. The moment you begin to picture yourself in that situation, it completely changes your point of view. So it's a matter of engaging and bringing these, and I keep using that word, those uncomfortable situations, because we tend to shy away. We like comfort. We like to continue to do things that we're good at. We like to learn what we may already have a little bit knowledge of. But when we feel uncomfortable and we are open to learning is, I think, when we begin to transform ourselves in the view of society.
I would agree with that, and I think, so I get posed some version of this question a lot because I'm in the sciences, and so what I often have, a not uncommon reaction when I talk about my other work or how to bring a feminist or anti-racist perspective to science is, well, that's political. And it's not objective. It's like it's polluting objective, pure science. And I think for me, it's really important to push back against the sort of coding as neutral science. Science already isn't objective. The Department of Defense is the largest science funder in the country. Our science it's never been objective. We study cancer treatments versus new antibiotics because cancer is much sexier to study than antibiotic research because you don't get a lot of prestige. It's hard to get tenure if you're not getting your papers cited a lot. All of these things are factors that already influence the sorts of scientific hypotheses, and that's just funding. Then you have, the coding of hypotheses predominantly created by one sector of society as like sort of neutral, natural areas of investigation. So for me, I think I try really hard to help students. I often find that especially newer students are resistant to this idea that science isn't objective sometimes. I think there's a lot of safety. It is an uncertain world, and there's safety in thinking, well, at least, 2 + 2 = 4. At least there's an answer in my chemistry class. And to bring in this idea of science as a social practice, and to complexify the situation, and ask students, how are hidden assumptions about how the world works influencing the hypotheses that we're capable of thinking through. It sometimes makes people uncomfortable. But I think, like you said, that is the goal of a university, in some ways, is to help encourage that sort of thinking. So I guess, but then I often find that that realization, like the moment when students, when they get that what I'm saying when I say science isn't neutral. People have hypotheses that come from their own cultural positioning. That's not to say that science doesn't work. That's not to say that like you can't run a serum sample for an immune protein and get the same result in England that you would get in a lab here that you would get in India within some acceptable range of variation. But what it's to say is that the questions that we're asking this data to do and the way that we interpret the data is all dependent upon who the human is that's asking the question. And when students really get that, it's, I think, really rewarding for them, and also very rewarding as an educator. And then I enjoy my collegial conversations with other scientists where I encourage them to not bringing an anti-racist attitude to science isn't political. Science has always had a perspective that it's bringing. There's been a tremendous amount of work studying how racism and discrimination affect biology within the body within the last 10 years, right? Studying how it affects blood pressure, cortisol, lifelong stress levels, et cetera. That work could have been happening and would have been, in the 1940s and 50s. Nobody was doing that work then. And it's because there weren't scientists practicing who were coming from communities of color. Those are the scientists that have brought those hypotheses to the field. So, we had decades of hypotheses that were just invisible to the people that were practicing scientists. We were studying stress biology in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, but nobody was asking how racism affected stress biology. So I try to, for both colleagues and for students, push against the idea that we're bringing a political perspective. It's never been objective.
So your question was specifically about the academy and what the academy can do in various social problems that we see in society. So I'm a firm believer, if you can't tell already, in education for the incarcerated. I mentioned my son earlier. My wife and I have two sons. Our older son, he's 4, and we give him timeouts. That's a way that we, give him discipline. But it's not enough to do the 3-minute or the 4-minute timeout and say, okay, you've put in your 4 minutes, come out and let's continue on with the evening. There has to be a moment of education. And so we go in and we talk about what was wrong, and then we try to set a new path. And I think that's really, really important for those who are incarcerated, that it's not just time, but that there is actual, and it's not just punishment, but that there is actual rehabilitation. And we here in this room are firm believers in education, and knowledge is power. And so to not give the incarcerated an education is not setting them up for success when they leave. So if you go to prison when you're 20, you stay there for 30 years, you come out when you're 50 years old, and if there has been no education, you come out of prison with a criminal record. Many times you cannot rent an apartment, you cannot get a loan, you cannot get a job, you cannot make big purchases like a house. So what are you going to do? And what if during those years, those decades, you've lost relationships with people who love you and family members and friends? And so recidivism is huge, and lawmakers will be looking specifically at recidivism. Well, the Boston University Prison Education Program, which I'm very proud of, is just one of a handful of universities in the country that grants full degrees to men and women who are incarcerated. And I'm very, very proud of that program, and I'm very proud that BU, after all of these years, just continues to invest in men and women who are incarcerated. And I'm not so much concerned with recidivism rates. I'm concerned with educating prisoners, but for those who have graduated from the Boston University Prison Education Program, I think it's less than 1% of those people who complete the degree land back in prison, because knowledge is power, and can set people up on a new path and give people skills to be able to get a job or go on to graduate school when they leave prison. So that's really important. And prisons across the country have lots of religious programming, and they'll have drug rehabilitation, Alcoholics Anonymous, and all of those things, and they're good things. But I think education is really paramount, especially if an incarcerated individual has not had access to an education before.
Great, thank you. So I'm gonna kind of play devil's advocate and think about what some of the critics of the kind of scholarship that we're all committed to do. So there are kind of two key criticisms of engaged scholarship. And the first, and I guess I'll ask you to respond to that one, is that it's somehow not rigorous research, that it's not pure scholarship because it's designed with this agenda of social equity, and it's not just about sitting in a classroom and reading the canonical texts and writing papers. It's about engaging with communities and a different kind of approach to learning. So how do you respond to those criticisms that somehow engaged scholarship isn't as rigorous or as academic as non-engaged scholarship, for lack of a better term?
Can we call all non-engaged scholarship non-engaged scholarship?
Sure, yeah. I like that.
I think I would respond, much the way that I was just talking about with the pushing back that this other scholarship is somehow, operating in some neutral location. But I also think, just because you're doing something, so for my graduate dissertation project, for the bulk of it, I did this study where I studied immune function and chronic disease risk in immigrants. And people had buy-in to my project. The community liked me. It was a fine project. We had these big health fairs, and a lot of the community that I worked with was undocumented. And at the health fairs, whether you're in the project or not in the project, it didn't matter. Even if you were just passing through the building, you could get all of this information and then speak about it with a healthcare worker and get referrals to places that accepted people without insurance and stuff like that. So they liked, people, there's buy-in, the benefit, they liked that benefit. But as I was doing the project, I realized that nobody really cared. They didn't really care about their own immune function and health. A lot of these people had immigrated because they wanted a better life for their kids. And what they were really curious about is how the lack of physical activity and the changes in sports accessibility moving from Ecuador to Connecticut was affecting their kids' health. And they really wanted to know about diabetes in their kids, and they wanted to know how it related to diet and physical activity and all this stuff. If I had involved them in the research from the very get-go, right? If I had come to them and said, I do immune function research, I have access to funding, I would like to help create a project, I'm interested, maybe I had some connection to the community, they would have said, I think that there would have been a lot of interest in, let's do a project that studies this in children. And then they could have taken the results from that project and used it to justify grants to support after-school rec programs or something like that. Instead, in that project, nothing about that project would have been less rigorous. It would have been the same collections of blood samples. It would have been the same sort of having kids wear accelerometers to measure how much they move around in a day or whatever. Scientifically, the project would have been just as sound, but it would have asked a different question that would have been more useful to the community. And so I think the research that I do is still scientifically sound. It's still fundable. It's still, but I want to make the process of research less divorced from what what people want to see happen.
Elizabeth, I think that's a really important and a crucial question. because we get it all the time. This is something that those of us who work outside, labels matter. And how you label your work and the type of research that you're doing will really factor in how your work is received. So to say that I work on Latin American science, immediately people are like, well, those two don't fit together, right? And how do you respond is something that is really interesting, because I've had a lot of pushback because of the type of work that I do, because of the people whom I call scientists, who for many people that isn't the definition of what a scientist should look like. And I don't have an easy answer, because it really depends on the context, but I'll give you maybe two examples. I was recently at an agricultural history conference, because there is such a thing, and I was talking about the Green Revolution, which some of you may or may not know about, which really changed not just the level of food production, but nutrition levels in the mid-20th century. And in the first generation, it really felt like it was going to end hunger. As we now know, the overuse of fertilizers and irrigation canals has led to a series of social problems. But in that first generation, it was really pivotal, and people really thought that they had found the cure to end global hunger in the 1960s. So I was giving a paper at this conference, and I was talking about how the Green Revolution, the first experiments, were done in Mexico. And the seeds that went and ended the first famine went from Mexico to India and Pakistan. But we normally don't think of food aid as coming from a place like Mexico. So the first question that I get is from a person who raises his hand, and he says, "I don't believe you." And he proceeds to ask his question. So I am a full professor at Harvard, and my credibility from the first question was being put on the table. The fact that because of who I was, but also the type of research that I was engaged in, allowed someone, or felt they had permission, to question me and my authority and my legitimacy as a scholar from the get-go. So I have taken, with age, it wasn't always my response, but with age, I have taken it as an educational moment, right? Instead of lashing out a series of, well, look, bam, 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 I say, okay, here's someone who could really be taught. And how am I going to teach them? What is my approach? And I just begin to, not just simply state facts, but try to understand where someone is coming from, that they could feel that blurting that out, and trying to diminish me as a scholar first, before asking a question, what that means. So to get back to your question, I think it's a constant. And I think if one is going to be engaged in this type of work, it has to be expected. So you really have to be prepared intellectually, emotionally, physically. That tells you a lot about my approach, about how you personally will respond to the critiques that your research or your work or the type that teaching that you bring to the classroom is not X, valid, strong enough, legitimate, rigorous. Add any adjective that you wish. And it's your training, and it's your scholarship, and it's the due diligence and your 140% of work that you put in that really will begin to diminish those questions.
So your question is about either pushback or those in the field not thinking that this type of research is particularly rigorous. Okay.
That's real research, or that
Okay.
it's, yeah.
Sure. So a quick story about a pushback that I received from a colleague. One of my colleagues saw in a conference brochure that I was giving a presentation on my work in prisons. And he came up to me and he said, "Oh, I saw that you're giving a presentation on what you go in and do for those bad people." and I was really shocked that someone even thought that. I brought, and I can, I'm happy to show people after the session today, but one of the things that I've done as part of my research, because I have the men and women singing, I've wanted to record their singing and our music making together, and I haven't been able to do that either via audio or video recording. But what I have done is I've had students put different journal entries, different artwork in these books that I've produced every week or every semester. There's all sorts of artwork and personal expression and collages and different things like that. But one of the pieces of artwork that's really, really powerful to me, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to find it at this very moment, is just a very talented artist in the prison drew a picture of the prison walls and then bricks and the barbed wire up at the top. And on every single brick was the name of a lifer. So a man sentenced to die in prison. So their names are on the bricks. And something that I think one of the clubs at the prison does is every year reads out the names of the men who have died in prison. And so it's this beautiful piece of artwork. And I think when you hear people's stories and what led them on a certain path, you don't think of the people as bad people. And it could be you or it could be me in the prison. And then as far as I teach a class on qualitative research at Gordon College, and my colleague teaches, we actually team teach the class. So she does the quantitative portion and I do the qualitative portion. And students, they somewhat ask, like, which type of research is more rigorous? Is it the quantitative? Is it those who are looking at recidivism rates and number of people who are incarcerated in the country and all of that? Are they looking at these hard facts, or are they doing more narrative work? And so what I say to people is, like, yes, there are numbers, but they don't tell the whole story. You can make numbers say what you want them to say. Numbers aren't necessarily nuanced, but people's stories from them are nuanced. And I think I mentioned the gun problem in the United States and school shootings, and I think we see those numbers and we're shocked by them, and I think we should be, but there's a lot more subtlety than just the numbers. So.
Yeah. Okay, so on the other side of this question is this idea that somehow engaged scholarship actually like reifies or mimics existing social inequities because of the relative imbalance of power and privilege between the communities and the institution. And the ways in which communities are defined. And Gabriela, you talked about this a little bit, about the privilege that we all have as being part of institutions of higher learning. But how do you respond to this challenge that again, it sets up this like researcher-subject relation with communities that may be vulnerable or underserved?
Yeah. Do you want to?
Sure. So I think this is a critique with some valid points, right? And it's important, I think, to not to pretend like this is going to be like the end all be all to doing research. Like, even if you're talking about engaged scholarship as CBPR, and I don't think that is community-based participatory research is a type of doing, a way of doing scientific research. That's a lot of what I've been talking about, like involving communities more in like the planning of the research, determining the content, etc. But there's a lot of problems with it too. It takes a long time. Communities don't, first of all, you're right, the word community, like that's a huge placeholder word. What do we mean by that? Who's a community, If you're talking, the way I see it as the best defined is for instance, like the tribal communities within Maine. Those are communities. They usually have some sort of board representation, people that can make decisions for other people within the community, et cetera. There's points of interaction and structure. The refugees in Maine, that's not really a community. Even if you were to say like some refugees from Somalia, still not a community. Like there's different ethnic groups that have come from Somalia. The refugees in Lewiston are much more conservative, like it's a very conservative Muslim community, whereas in Portland, it's a more progressive Muslim community. Even within Lewiston, there are people that would not feel that the imam at the local mosque represented their own views. So who's the community there? Like, and who gets to control data? Who gets to say that research can or can't come to a? So it's a trouble. Community is, and then when you get to things like, let's say men who have sex with men in rural Maine, or opiate addicts, then it's like, is that a community? What if people don't want to identify as being part of the community? So it's tricky for when I think about like doing scientific research with humans, which is who I work with. This idea of community, and I think there's some valid criticisms there. I don't think that it changes the intent, like the importance of the intent, and there's a lot of room to continue improving how we do research like this. And I don't know if it always has to recreate the dynamics. I think inherently, like if you're somebody coming with access to grant funding and access to power and access to university prestige, especially at a university like Harvard or something, that's an inherent power dynamic that's going to be difficult to shift. So I think making sure that people really are truly free to participate in the research and to tell you to, take a hike if they don't want to be part of your project. And I think for me, engagement, when I think about the difference between community-based participatory research and engaged scholarship, like one of the things I love about my current job is that I interact with people on a huge amount of things that have nothing to do with my academic research goals. And so I think I have a much better sense of what's happening within the community. I'm supportive of the community in different ways that don't have anything to do with my research. And so I think you could do CBPR and still be a pretty disengaged scholar. And I think it's a challenge that helps. I think if you can help step towards a dynamic where sometimes you're interacting with people in a totally different perspective, like you're showing up at instances that have nothing to do with your research, and being part of the life that happens in other areas. It might help shift that dynamic. That's a big ask though. I mean, academics are already really busy. I work 2 jobs. Not everybody's going to be able to do work like this, I have a really supportive partner who doesn't mind the fact that he's home with the kids a lot while I do other things, I have a lot of social support besides that. So it's a hard ask how to fit this stuff into academic structures. They're not friendly to imagine if instead of postdocs, people went, and if you wanted to do work with LGBTQ folks, instead of a postdoc, you went and spent a couple of years working at a community center that served LGBTQ youth. Right now that's considered a non-academic career. I think I'm still in academia, but I was just talking to somebody in my old department, and they're like, "Oh, well, you've left academia." I think that's crazy, but we have a difficult time translating into academic perspectives things that don't fit into that, and I think it's a challenge. Those power dynamics are a real challenge.
So, if I understood your question, how about the problem with reifying those identities? Right now, this semester, I'm teaching a class on the border, and it's race and violence on the Mexico-U.S. border, which is very topical, very pertinent. And when the students come in, they come in with certain ideas in terms of what they're going to learn, what they're going to be leaving with. And they're surprised when we're talking about violence in public health on the bodies of Mexican bodies, not the other way around. And to learn, this week we were just talking about the drug war. And I go back to this word that I mentioned earlier, uncomfortable truths, or uncomfortable, and we have to have the whole, as a historian, a larger perspective. So when we talk about something as timely and contentious as the border has become, well, it has historically always been, but more in this particular moment in our history, how do we do it without going into simple stereotypes or into facile understandings of a black and white dimension, which it is not, and it's so much more complex. So for me, I have the luxury of being a historian and building up a case over time with documents, with photographs, with soundscapes, and letting the documents speak for themselves, whatever form they take, and letting students draw conclusions themselves from the evidence that they see of history over time. Because it's very different for me to say, black and brown bodies are constantly visited with violence when they go into public health institutions over historical times. That is going to ring empty. But if I then say, okay, let's look at this case study, let's look at this hospital, let's look at this community center, let's look at this, and over time, let's look at the sterilization of Latina women in the 1970s in Los Angeles. And there's a documentary that came out a year and a half ago. Then that means something very different. So but that doesn't mean, so I have to bring these subjects there, but I also have to contend with the fact that there are black and brown bodies that do commit crimes. And by not denying that, by being aware and being, yes, we're all human, by not negating the facts, I think that lets it be more open to the complexity of just simply the human experience, that we are not black and white, that we have so many more shades of gray that make us so much more interesting, but it's much more complex to tell these stories.
So, I don't think I've seen more of an imbalanced power dynamic as I have in prisons, the various prisons and juvenile detention centers that I've visited. There's the inmates, and then, as the inmates call them, the police or the corrections officers. And I have seen, and in my opinion, from the corrections officers, I have seen an abuse of power in terms of how they would talk to the men and women who are incarcerated. The corrections officers do not like me. They do not like me coming in because they see me as someone who is empowering the inmates. They've told me as much. And they say, the inmates are on their best behavior when you're there, and they're, goody two-shoes, essentially, when you're there. And then when you're not there, all hell breaks loose. And they've told me different things like this. But my style of teaching, especially in the prison, is highly democratic. So not requiring the prisoners to address me by a title, by my first name. A lot of work in a circle. The first thing that I do in the classroom, I don't think your classes here at Harvard are like this, but walking around the room and greeting every single person in the room has to greet everyone else, shake their hand, and give them a morning greeting, look them in the eye, because we are all human beings, and we're all worthy of respect. And so I try the best that I can to break down even like teacher-student dynamics. And in the field of music and in the field of conducting, I mean, I can't think of more of an authoritarian field than conducting. If you were to walk into the Boston Symphony Orchestra rehearsal, probably going on right now for tonight, it is not a democracy. It is play louder here, that note is flat, raise it. And so I want to break those things down in our music making so that every single voice is respected, every single voice is valued. So I look to do that in my teaching. And I've actually, in music education, there are many different styles. You may have heard of the Kodai method or the Delcroze method. And my colleagues and I have come up with something that we call empowering song. So empowering participation and empowering participants to share their stories and who they are through the music that we make. So empowerment is something that is really, really important to me in classroom situations and especially in prisons.
Wow, I want to take classes with all three of you. They all sound incredible. Okay, so I think with that, I will open it up. I have many more questions, but I'd love to just hear and give everybody in the audience the opportunity to engage with our panelists. So you can ask a question to the entire panel or a specific panelist. Nothing is off the table.
Thank you all for coming. This has been really awesome and inspiring, and I'd love to hear all about your work. So I'm currently starting sort of the process of getting into research. I'm a sophomore, so sort of like the natural trajectory. But something that I've noticed that is sort of like fundamentally different about the way that all three of you, actually all four of you, Professor Hinton, you're definitely included in this, is how you start almost with service and then from there build research off of that. Whereas I think that oftentimes in academia we see it sort of reversed, that like research starts first, we come in from the outside and we sort of build off service from there in some sense, through philanthropy or through volunteering. And I'd like to hear a little bit more about like how the research process looks different for you all, because I've heard like starting and asking community members the questions that you should be asking. That's something that I've never heard been done before in the research process, like asking the communities that you're working with what they are looking for. So is there like any, I guess, advice that you would give us to sort of fundamentally flip that process and start in communities, and how do you make sure that you're doing that in a way that the research that you build off of that feels useful to the communities that you're working with?
That's a great question. I think, and how I think the way you're phrasing it really illustrates how you're already thinking about the very research that you're going to be doing. For me personally, because I'm really interested in perspectives that so far haven't dominated the field of history of science and haven't really been written about, I spend a lot of time, especially right now with my current work, sitting down and talking to indigenous farmers, and sitting down and speaking to the Yaqui or the Mayo in northern Mexico. And I'm currently doing a project that goes between India and northern India and northern Mexico. And the moment you sit down, your questions change, because from the moment you have a meal with someone that has a story so compelling, and you realize it's compelling because it's their story, you immediately expand your questions. So I think, just to give you a concrete because instead of giving you an esoteric example, I think to constantly revisit the questions that you've created and to ask yourself, and truthfully, how would I change this question if I was the person that's being asked? What might be the most, you have a goal, it's to get a degree, it's to get a job, it's to X. But and you know what you are going to gain from the research. But what might be important for the person that you're asking a question of or that is the subject of your research? And if you ask that simple question, you'll see that your own research will be enriched because you've flipped it in a way that forces you to think in a different direction or think of your own work in a different way.
I really agree with that answer. Research can serve a lot of purposes, and some of the research that I'm doing, I'm hoping that that will be the sort of research that generates a bunch of publications within the next few years. That gets me that tenure track job. That gets me, I'm a scientist. Like, I'm an academic scientist. That is part of what I want research to do for me. I've been working with a lot of immigrant-led nonprofits lately. We work on all sorts of stuff that's not related to the academic stuff, but we are also working on these academic research projects. And what I realized through them is that they would like some of the data that we generate for them to be able to use it. They're excited. They want this data to be able to use to support their own grant applications, a totally different world of grants. It's like a bunch of social service grants, right? Where they want grants to do direct case management so they can give people employment counseling and stuff like that and have it be funded. A lot of them are scraping together funding from different sources, especially the newer organizations are scraping together funding from different sources or doing a lot of work unfunded. The people that are most helping the immigrant and the refugee and asylee community in Maine are other people from the refugee and asylee community that have been here a few years. And so for them to be able to double duty the research data and to take research data that's generated for a scientific research project and say, our adolescents that come in this age range experience these increased levels of stressors related to these factors in their lives, and we think we could address this with this project, and you should give us, $100,000 for it to whatever funding agency they're applying for. That helps. Them too. So I think I do think talking about research I would love to see research become academic research doesn't have to just benefit academics, and it's funded by society. Society's paying for it through the NIH and NSF. It should, the results should benefit society in the broadest way possible.
I'll be very brief. I think it's important if you're working with participants or different community groups to work hard to have rapport with those in the community. And then I think something that's been really important for me, because as a professor, as an academic, I like to talk, but to do the absolute opposite and listen. And as Gabriela said, have your questions thought out, but then be ready to change based on the need. So I've learned to have a more organic process to my research. Many of my colleagues, myself included, are very type A. I need to get the answer to this question, and I need to do this. I'm going to ask the questions in this order, and I'm going to get the answers, and I'm going to put it together. I'm going to code it, whatever. But to allow the project to be more organic and to go where it will, or based on based on a feeling that you have. So.
Yeah, and just to jump in on that question, because I think it really does highlight so much of what we've been talking about during this session. I think what Heather said is really important, that our work should not, academic work should not just be about benefiting academics, but the communities that we care about. And so that also speaks to one of the earlier questions I asked about kind of what higher education's role should be in addressing issues of social justice. And what you said, about the kind of another way to flip it, and I think you mentioned this in the way that you framed the question, is there's a long history of academics going into the community, into various communities, different from their own, and doing research on communities. And now there's kind of a push doing research with communities. So instead of going in, as you said, with like a formulated research question and agenda, it's, okay, this is a community that that I care about and that I want to work with and that I'm interested in. What are the questions that they want answered? What do they want me to look into? And the research that I'm doing now is very much, or at least it's an attempt to do work in that spirit. So I'm working in Stockton with various community groups, victims' rights groups, trauma support groups, and the police department. And the police chief has invited me to come there to help him do some of the racial reconciliation work that he's doing in the Stockton community and uncover the history of police community tensions there in order to kind of address some of the problems that are going there today. So he came to me and said, you have expertise on this, we could really use it here. And now I'm working with the community to say, what are the things that you'd like me to look into based on your experiences with the police department? And I think that what's exciting for me about doing this work is that it speaks to things that I'm interested in, and of course I'm formulating my own research questions, but I'm constantly getting input from communities themselves. And I think related to the question about community engaged work not being rigorous, it comes from this elitist assumption that somehow people in the communities that we're studying don't have expertise that far surpasses our own, or that we don't have anything to learn from them. So in thinking for me, when I'm trying to start like a prison education program here and to have a combined classroom that involves both incarcerated and campus-based students, if I'm teaching a class on mass incarceration, that discussion can't just be academics who've researched the problem or reading, the books about it. It's actually learning about experiences firsthand, which is so much about what Jamie's work is doing in that specific, respect as well. So I think that the idea of kind of flipping it so that it's not researching on, but researching with and on behalf of, and again, like what everybody's been saying up here, listening to what people actually want you to do, and to work together to think about how you can combine expertise and resources to really address a problem and come up with solutions. Other questions? Yeah, right here. We'll go back and then forward, because I saw your hand first.
Yeah, great, thank you. Thank you all for being here. My name is Sophie. I'm a senior at Tufts. And this past fall, I was taking a course at MCI Shirley, Medium Security Prison. It was a literature course that was taught in an inside-out style. So I was going into the prison every week for co-learning. And one of my projects that has kind of come out of that has been looking at incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people's stories as a form of currency for engaging the economy and academia once they're released.
Mm-hmm.
I was curious to know if you had any thoughts on that, as somebody who said that they try to integrate quotes and stories from incarcerated people into research.
Sure. I mean, I'm seeing these types of classes more and more, and you mentioned it, these inside-out classes, and I've done that with my students, bringing them in to perform at MCI Norfolk. And I think, as you're saying, you can sit in a classroom and you can talk about something, or you can actually go and experience it. I think stories are powerful, and as I said, they're very nuanced, and with permission of inmates who have been released, I have published stories, and I think it's important for the larger community to hear these types of stories, and just to hear the nuance. So I think it's wonderful what you've done, and I'd love to show you after this session if you'd like to see any of these things.
It reminds me of
So.
the same kind of thing that we had at the end of my class.
Yeah.
We have to
And just, I have a shameless plug since you're at Tufts, which is related to your question. Next Monday, Michelle Jones, who is a formerly incarcerated scholar, but as soon as she was released, she began a PhD program at NYU, and basically while she was incarcerated in Indiana, did original archival research on the history of the Indiana Women's Prison, which was the first single-sex facility, and used that to publish academic journals while she was incarcerated and present at conferences. And so she's going to be speaking about some of her research, but exactly what you're talking about, the ways in which she actually used the stories of women who were incarcerated there in the 19th century to transform the way that we understood that prison, combined with the stories of women who she was incarcerated with there, which landed her into a PhD program at NYU. So I really encourage you to come and hear Michelle present. It's at 5 p.m. somewhere at Tufts. So.
In the Sophia Gordon multipurpose room.
Okay, so they're Boston-based people. And I'll be in conversation with her, so it should be really exciting. She's one of my favorite people in the world. Okay, here.
So I really appreciate this question of, also thank you all for being here, about kind of like the criticism or like the pushback that you often face as academics of like, is your research, really rigorous? And I really actually appreciate having two like more like science-based historians and like researchers, because I feel like I often see these sorts of panels, and this is something that I personally have to interact with a lot, because I am a very, very humanities-oriented person with entirely CS math friends. And so I often find myself wanting to like justify and validate that what I do like is also real and tangible and produces things. But what they're doing is like very, very real and very tangible and produces like money things. So I'm wondering how like, I try to take these classes that are, outside of the comfort zone of the humanities, like trying to take like physics and computer science, even if that's not my area. But noticing that when the farther I get from these sort of more like humanist-oriented studies, like, from history and like history of science, but also like biology, to like CS, where someone's like sitting in front of a computer coding, that there really is this like ridiculous divorce between the way that they see their own work and the work that like transpires into like the world. Like, I think of these like racist AIs, like robots that like keep coming up, and people keep wondering like, why is that? What is going on like in the academy, and like how does academia convince itself that this is like really valid work, and how can like departments like talk to each other and integrate more, so that it's not necessarily on the burden, I mean it can be on the burden of students to like try to change this paradigm, but how it might become easier to like get that sort of integrative knowledge, even for like a CS major, to like learn about the importance of like community engagement.
I think it's gonna you're asking that question, and simply asking that question already makes it valid, and it means that the question has either not been asked before or it hasn't been followed through. And just like Heather gave the example of work that was being done in the 40s and 50s, but no one was asking the question because it really wasn't reflective of the group that those researchers were coming from. So the very fact that you're even thinking about that question, or that you're raising the question, already means that potentially you will do something to bridge that, because you have already noticed that there is a problem. And so you are on the right track. Just keep going. And it's exactly people like you who are engaging with these questions, who are seeing that there is a void, that a bridge needs to be done, and you're taking physics and you're taking humanities classes. Come on, I mean, that's fantastic. You're exactly the type of person who can begin to do that.
I think about this a lot, because I think part of the problem in academia is that we are really, really siloed, and that is institutionally part of academia. It is hard, as an interdisciplinary scholar, it is hard to have your work legible in different departments. In WGS departments, my work they're skeptical of the science of my work, skeptical that I'm going to come in and be like a biological determinist. But in science departments, they're wondering, why am I presenting at these feminist conferences? Why am I publishing in this feminist journal? What am I talking about? Am I going to come in and tell them that there is no true reality? So I think it's, any individual can do whatever they want, but we have structural problems within academia as an institution that prevent that question that person gave you at that conference, like how's your work going with those bad people? That's a crazy question for people from a bunch of different fields. Like there are fields where if you haven't read the new Jim Crow, if you're not aware of work like your work, like there are whole disciplines where this idea that we have a problem over mass incarceration in the U.S. is something that is like, you would never get a question like that. That's such an interesting question because it says so much about what is common knowledge in different disciplines, you know. And some disciplines are having these really active conversations around mass incarceration in the U.S. And then there's other disciplines that are they view that as somehow like they're just not part of those conversations at all. So I don't know. We're really siloed. Academia is super siloed, and that's related to like the requirements to get jobs. It's related to how departments have to compete over tenure track lines, and they don't want to share tenure track lines with other departments. It's related. Those are like all like huge structural institutional things that it doesn't matter if you're a student that does really wonderful interdisciplinary work if nobody can read what that work means within their disciplines, and so you can't find a place to do that work. And
I just want to add something because I think it's also a question of language, right? And how we speak. So if you can speak the language of physics, but you can also speak the language of history, because we are siloed, then you can do this. And I'm coming from a Department of History of Science where many of so my colleagues, one is trained initially as a physicist, another one's a biologist. There are 2 MDs, and they have all gone on to do history. I was going to be an organic chemist, but I failed miserably, so I took on a better field of history.
Yes.
But to be able to, we each speak a different language. And to be able to have, if you have the ability to move between those 2 worlds, others do it. And I don't, yes, keep. Yeah, I do agree we're siloed.
I don't mean to be, I don't mean to be like negative.
I do agree that we're siloed, but I do think that we need, to break those silos, we need more, and it's more than being interdisciplinary. It's the ability to take the tools and learn the craft that will allow you to be successful in those fields so that you can dialogue with both.
More questions? Yeah, over here.
Hi, thank you all for being here. My question is, so the stakes of engaged scholarship work are much higher because you're intentionally impacting and working with people. So how do you all pace yourselves in the urgency of this work and take care of yourselves as this work can be very emotional and really relate to your heart?
That is a question.
Yeah.
I mean, I think I was at a Ford Foundation conference a couple of years ago. I was actually years ago at a different conference near UCLA, and one of the panelists got very sick. He had to be removed. An ambulance had to come get him. And he came back the next year and says, we really need a panel to talk about our health. Mm-hmm. Because what we're dealing with, there's only so much a human body can carry. So as professors, we're researchers, we're teachers, we are editors of our own work, but we're also all these, so many different identities that we have. And then you're dealing with the emotions of having to interact with the people that you are often researching and the people who question your own research. So I'm really glad that you asked that question because it is incredibly tough on the body. And I think if we're not upfront about it, then we can't take care of ourselves. I think it's no coincidence that there is a high incidence of diabetes among scholars of color, that the levels of stress, so to be aware of these health dangers, it really already makes you, in a way, empowered to be able to exercise daily, take care of what you eat, in addition to all these other tasks and duties. But I'm so glad it's a pivotal question that we don't talk enough about.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I had to I had to get off social media completely, although I'd like to start it again. I go back and forth because you kind of need it for an academic career in some ways. You need to have some sort of interaction with the world where you're promoting, basically self-promotion. But I am in deep, in the state refugee health coordinator job, I get huge amounts of information daily about what is happening with refugee resettlement, with immigration more broadly, with undocumented immigrants, with ICE raids, and it's this incredible amount of information every day, all day long. And then for me, like logging into social media, like being in that world, like working with people who are experiencing a lot of discrimination as they walk around a small city in Maine, having people who are, afraid that their family isn't going to be able to come even though their visas were approved. And then logging onto social media and hearing about how messed up it is with like all these other areas of life right now was too much. And I felt like overwhelmed all the time. So I think like for me, self-care was reducing exposure. I started getting a newspaper sent to my house. It's like super old school. It comes to my porch every morning, and I like take my news in. And then the rest of the world, like all the other issues that are part of life, can like greet me in paper form, and I can step away from it. But it's not like on my phone all day long. I had to limit. I had to like titer it out because my work is really like I'm in it all the time for work, and so to then have it be the rest of my life too was. I have 2 small children, like it's not responsible of me to let myself get so overwhelmed with work that it's negatively impacting my ability to like be present with my family or something. So it's hard though. My kids sounds like the same age as yours. There's a lot.
For me, I think looking at the problem of mass incarceration is huge as we've talked about, and it's too big for me to handle, and I am not a politician. I am not an attorney. I am not a judge. I am a musician. But doing what I can for my students, there is a ripple effect, and I've seen that. And education I've seen it change families. It doesn't just change that one person who's incarcerated, it really changes their family. So just realizing that the work that you do, that there is this ripple effect. There was one man with whom I worked, and he when he first was incarcerated, I think he was at a 5th grade reading level. So this adult man, 5th grade reading level, and he did the school program that they have at the prison, like 5th grade through 12th grade, and then was pretty close to graduating the BU program, the bachelor's program, and he received an A on everything, like every single report. And he was just like, every time my daughter comes, I show her that I have received an A, like on everything, every class. And it was something that he was so proud about, and he should be. And so like that changes his daughter. And so I think just realizing, I think for me, that there is a ripple effect to the work that we do, and we don't have to fix the whole problem, but we do have to be engaged and serve where we can. So.
Yeah.
Thank you all so much. I feel like I have so many questions, things to think about, which is really exciting. You've all spoken about being changed by your work, and also how you are intrinsically a part of your work, and I think often academia asks that we remove ourselves from our work, and like you mentioned, kind of the objective scientist or the objective researcher. And so I'm wondering how you both like continue to let yourself be open to being changed by your work, and also like how do you locate yourself in your work, if at all, in whatever you please. Yeah, to the whole.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry.
Go ahead.
So how we allow ourselves to be changed by our work, is that? And
like how you kind of acknowledge yourself in your work. If that makes sense.
That's a really interesting question, and I'll use myself as an example. So, as I said, we all have multiple identities, so I'm X here. But when I do research in Mexico, in rural Mexico, I become a completely different person. Not me, myself, I'm still myself, but how I am perceived. As someone who comes, certainly coming from Harvard, but coming from the United States, being able to speak a different language, having the research funds that allow me to be in a place or a space, that is a completely different person. And I have to be able to maneuver these multiple identities that place depending on where I am. The fact that gender matters more in certain contexts, that gender might matter more than the credentials that I have after my name in certain spaces, that where I come from or the Spanish that I speak. And being fully aware of those different identities also allows me to be more cognizant that I can slip in and out, and that is a privilege, right? To be able to slip in and out and use these different roles to navigate these different spaces. So how I do that is being very aware of my personal privilege when I am in these spaces, and being aware of how that is seen differently when I'm here at a faculty meeting at Harvard or in front of a classroom with incredibly engaged students. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but I think the ability and the knowledge that one can navigate multiple identities while having very different privileges in different spaces. You're welcome.
For me, my family is my top priority, and so I, like the other professors on the panel, are involved in many projects simultaneously, and probably too many for the sake of my health and all of that. But I think just putting things in priority and deciding what your priority is going to be in life, and for me, it's my family. So there are others with whom I work who they will have incarcerated individuals with whom they've worked when they're released from prison over at their house or something like that. I choose not to do that because of my young family, and I don't want to necessarily bring like what I do like directly home. But those who decide to do that, I think it's fine for them. So I think just deciding what you I think just deciding on what a healthy balance looks like for you and what those boundaries will look like for you. And for me, they're different from the boundaries of my colleagues, and I think that's okay. So, yeah.
I'll take one more question back here. Yeah, you.
Great.
We're almost out of time.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I'm a student at Northeastern University. The research that I've been doing this semester has been on redistricting, like congressional redistricting and gerrymandering. And one of the value judgments that people have to make when they do redistricting that is coming up more and more is preserving communities of interest is the term that gets thrown out. And you talked a little bit earlier about how it's a super vague term. And it's something that gets talked about in the literature surrounding redistricting is what does that really mean? Who are those communities that we're trying to preserve and give a voice to? And I'm sort of curious, in you guys' experience, what constitutes a community? What are those sort of common threads that weave together different people that have all kinds of different identities that constitute a community that we should be either engaging with to do research or, in my case, giving a voice to?
Go ahead.
Yeah,
Big
so
question.
Yeah.
I just sat through. So there's a thing called like the Hanley Leadership Center in Maine, and they do they train nonprofit people working in nonprofits and healthcare to be leaders. Anyways, and a group of them were recently doing basically a project on just this question. So it's a really hard question and I think one thing I think about a lot lately is that I'm not just interested in immigrant health. I'm interested in, social determinants of health and how they affect immune function and chronic disease risk. I could see a world, like maybe even a world relatively soon, where I'm actually working with like middle-class white families to find out like how they're different. There's been a lot of work done around how social stressors affect the biology, and so it's not like that's a group that's like underrepresented in the work. But I don't think that like I want to be wary of. I think one thing I want to be wary of using the community, like sometimes I think like a mainstream section of society can use the word culture to define things that are different from the culture that they have. And there's a way that the dominant culture can become sort of invisible, and you will no longer see Thanksgiving as a cultural holiday or something like that. And I think like, I also want to recognize that I don't know what communities are. I think there are some really limited definitions of community that I would be like, that's a community that makes sense. I think that for me, the tribal communities are one of the ones that makes the most sense because they're often relatively small, very neatly defined, and they have like leadership. Beyond that, I think it gets really, really fuzzy. And I do want to try to think about like, not always assuming that a community is something that like there is a middle class white community. I live in Portland, Maine. I'm part of that community. It's a perfect city for me. We have lots of coffee and yoga, and I'm not joking. I'm part of a community that has a cultural thing happening in the community that I'm part of. So I think sometimes about like the tendency to sort of like leave my community unmarked and then talk about the refugee community or something, as if it's like a very discrete, defined entity. But nobody would ever expect that my views agree with my neighbor's views and agree with the person 3 houses down from us. And so communities aren't monoliths, but I don't know how to define a community. I think in some ways it should be partly self-defined, but then that's messy too. Because you're going to have people opting in and out all over the place.
So that is a huge question. Yeah. I mean, it's so wonderfully large. Entire books have been written about this. There are courses about what exactly is a community. And of course, as soon as you asked the question, I thought of the canonical work of Imagined Communities by Benedict Anderson. And I'll just very briefly say that this is a question about what are nations, right? And how are nations formed? And if I say, what is an American? And what are 3 things that make you an American? It's most likely that you will all come up with 3 very different answers, but many of those answers will probably converge. The reason they will converge is because we all speak a common language, which is one of the things where do we? In the US, we don't. There's a lot of people who don't speak English. But they're still part of this America, part of this United States. So then, is it language? Is it our point of view? Is it our address? Because you're doing redistricting, such important work. What is it that defines us as a community? And it turns out that definition shifts because we don't have a monolithic identity. We aren't one singular. So you probably have groups of friends that you tell certain things to, groups of friends that you go out for a beer, or maybe not yet, or yes, okay, great. So and groups of friends that you do X, right? So in similar ways, these are multiple and different communities, and historically, how do we define them is also going to be shaped not just by the person who's a part of the community, but the person who's engaging with and observing the community. And I could say so much more, but because Imagined Communities, which is one of my favorite books, which defies this notion that it's all imagined, right? The parameters, we shift them and we shape them over time.
All right, well, please join me in thanking once again our phenomenal panelists. And we look forward to continuing this conversation throughout the remainder of the conference. So we will see you there.